so on. And I'm sure that will continue. And it's actually an important example of what these technologies are good for, which is human communication. The first virtual reality technology was the telephone. I mean, 100 years ago, you could, for the first time, be with someone else as if you were in the same room talking, at least as far as the auditory sense was concerned, despite being hundreds of miles apart. And that had never happened before. You had to be physically together to hold a conversation. And the telephone is virtual reality. And we're going to add the other human senses. And it's basically promoting the basic human desire and goal of communication. And we will, with visual auditory environments, and in the teen years of this century and by the late 2020s, incorporating all of the senses by having virtual reality from within the nervous system, be able to extend this concept of the telephone to all forms of human communication. In terms of social and cultural impact, that's a positive thing in my view. We can see the harbingers of that already. There's new communities that have been formed on the internet where people are sharing common interests. Maybe they have an interest of some chronic disease they share, or some chronic problem that they're concerned about, or an interest in a certain form of music or whatever. We have very effective and powerful communities now that are forming, even despite the sort of crude form of virtual reality we have on the internet. And that's only going to manifest itself more strongly into sort of a where we can share, increasingly fine-grained interests.
In particular, I was more interested in how you would see things like what happens to the travel industry or what happens to the institution of marriage or things like that.
Well, I think all business models and social and cultural institutions ultimately will change, and they're gradually changing. The idea of nations is already changing. A lot of commerce just is on the internet and completely ignores national boundaries. And as people live longer and have new ways of communicating with one another, we have to rethink institutions like marriage. I think it's a good institution to be devoted to another individual. It's an ultimate form of communication, but all of these things we'll have to rethink, what our boundaries are, and as these new forms of reality come into being.
Yeah, your talk tonight described technologies that improve the moral development or the health of human beings as was manifested in their increased lifespan. And I was curious if there's any way that technologies can improve the moral development of human beings, or is that outside the scope of technology?
Well, I think it will be helpful actually to understand how human intelligence works and actually have better models of human dysfunction. What's going on in the brain of somebody who has schizophrenia or bipolar disease, aside from the fairly vague psychological models that we use today. And I mean, a fundamental issue, I think, is fundamentalism, where, and that's a source of a lot of conflict and a lot of disagreement about morality, whether we're defining human beings as a species that seeks constructively to go beyond our limitations, or whether we are just sort of fruit on the vine like any other natural creation that falls from the vine and is governed by our limitations. I think what is glorious about human beings is the exponential expansion of knowledge, and by the broadest terms, to include art and music and science, literature, technology, and so on.
I'm an IT guy, so I try to make a living with computer science. And I think most of the people I work with, you can probably categorize us into two groups. Those who believe, as you do, that there will be a crossover, as you said, between intelligence as we have it and the things we create. And those who think that it will be more of an asymptotic approach, never getting there. Your graphs show that looking back, all these curves, all these lines appear very kind of clearly. But of course, the detail looking forward at any of those points would have been impossible to guess. And this reminds me a little bit of what I heard about, not to be fancy here, but of Hegel in the early 1800s who thought that progress was linear, and he thought it all led to the fact that Germany in 1840 was heaven, and pretty much we were done. And one last comment I'd make, just to give, because I'm on the other side, I think it's more asymptotic, and I think the scanners, for example, I'll just stop at the scanners. I was at a cognition conference recently where people were bemoaning the fact that all these scanners, as it's called, in vivo scans, were flooding research money, and they were frustrated because people weren't really learning any more about what's going on in the brain. They were looking at all these color graphs. And every time they said to get money, you had to put down something that involved scanning research. But the original thought about what's going on in the brain was lacking.
Well, in terms of your first point, I actually do have a track record. And I haven't just been looking back. I've been looking forward for several decades. The book I wrote 20 years ago, The Age of Intelligent Machines, in the 1980s, came out at the end of the 1980s, had hundreds of predictions about the 1990s and the early 2000 years, including the emergence of a worldwide communication network and a lot of other things that have tracked quite accurately. And so these models have been working. They're not just, I understand your point about overfitting on back data. My company now is building models of the stock market and trying to predict what stocks will do, and the big danger and problem to avoid is overfitting on past data. But these trends actually have been tracking forward since I've been looking at them, which, as I say, is for several decades. I think you get into the specific politics of any field, you're going to find people complaining, not enough scanning, not enough modeling. If you step back, and so sometimes you talk to a particular scientist who's so concerned about trying to model one dendrite, and then tries to say, I'm having so much problem with this one ion channel on this one dendrite, how are we going to model the whole brain? Well, there are 50,000 brain scientists. Our tools are getting more and more powerful. A lot of scientists will take linear models because if they will say, well, we only solved 1% of this problem last year. It's going to take a century before we do this, without considering that the tools are going to get more and more powerful. I had a debate just like this with a Nobel Prize-winning biologist a few blocks from here. Said, it's going to be 100 years before we have self-replicating nanotechnology. I said, what do you base that on? Well, I think we've solved 1% of the problem over the last year. And I said, that's actually my intuition also. We've solved 1% of the problem. And it will take 100 years of progress to solve this problem at today's rate of progress. But we're making exponential gains in the rate of progress, and so we will do it in 20 years, according to my models. We are making dramatic progress. We have some very impressive, we've gone from sort of soup to nuts in terms of complete models and simulations of several important regions of the brain. These simulations are probably not perfect yet, but they're actually very impressive in what they can do. And you can see the ongoing exponential progression at every level in terms of scanning resolution, amount of data we're collecting, sophistication of the models. So, and the complexity is, it's important to understand that not every ion channel and dendrite is in exactly the place it needs to be. These are chaotic, self-organizing systems, and the amount of complexity in the design is manageable based on what I said earlier.
Thank you. My question is a little complex, but it involves application in life sciences of nanotechnology. And it's almost like I see a schizoid kind of situation where you have, as I hear you presenting, primarily a linear construct to get to an nth degree of finite structure, if it will, the brain, and so forth. And so let me present a case and situation in life science and see if there's any application, if you're doing any work, because I consider this more important than completing your expressed journey to the nth degree finite understanding. And that involves Alzheimer's disease. And the work of Dr. Kelleher in his book Brain Trust, where he talks about Yale's finding that over 10% of Alzheimer's patients are dying of mad cow disease. So my question is specifically